Boxy Boo go and what happened to the rest of the monsters in Poppy Playtime? Or will we see them in the next chapter? We already know a lot of monsters. We have 3 antagonists for each chapter, not counting the secondary monsters or the main villain, Prototype. But what about the other monsters? From the very first chapter, they showed us as if new monsters were coming, but years went by, sequels were released, and from all these drawn and toy creatures, we still haven't seen anyone. The only one predicted in the first chapter to appear was Kissy Missy, and still, some of these monsters really exist in the game as characters, but they were not in the main storyline. Instead, they are on the Mob Entertainment channel or in another game called Project Playtime. But where are they now? Why weren't they in the main storyline, or were they there as references? Let's talk about this. All right, let's start with the fact that we saw a certain character in Chapter 3 who wasn't supposed to be there. That is, we encountered him not in the form of a cardboard cutout or wall painting, maybe as some reference. No, this character was there as a monster, but at the same time wasn't in the 3rd chapter. I'm talking about Boxy Boo. Yes, we really met him at the end of the 3rd chapter, but only on a VHS tape. And yes, he was there, a full-fledged living monster, only we couldn't interact with him at all. There are many reasons why he wasn't included in the 3rd chapter, because we already have a lot of monsters, and Boxy Boo would simply be superfluous. Then why isn't Huggy Wuggy superfluous? Why include him in the game as hallucinations? They did it at least because Huggy Wuggy is a symbol of the game, but unexpectedly reviving him from the 1st chapter is a pretty lazy and very strange act, so he is in the form of hallucinations. And Boxy Boo is already in Project Playtime, where we can run away from him or play as his character, so he wasn't in the 3rd chapter. Maybe Boxy Boo was the most aggressive monster, firstly because he was the very first successful experiment, and secondly, there's a theory that he was created to eliminate employees who knew too much, because his initial functions are unclear, and what was the need for a big boxy demon at all? His original purpose might be hinted at in one of the old tapes where Boxy Boo just eats one of the employees, and all this happened long before the Joy Hour. Unexpectedly, someone decided to check the basement. Or maybe someone sent him there, lured into a trap. Well, that's all fine, but what about his further fate? Where is Boxy Boo running around, and will we be able to meet him in the future? It's a contentious point since, as I already said, Boxy Boo is in Project Playtime. The developers announced his debut even before the release of the 3rd chapter, and there you have it, his debut. You wanted to see Boxy Boo in the 3rd chapter, didn't you? You weren't deceived! No matter how you look at it, we have 2 options. Either Boxy Boo is alive or dead. But why could he be dead possibly as the most aggressive of the monsters? Prototype decided to get rid of him because he was too evil. Maybe because he turned out to be not very controllable since he was originally thought of as a killing machine, which we discussed, and the developers could indeed introduce such a story, though it would mostly seem like getting rid of the character. Bron, the dinosaur, is another interesting character, one we've all been waiting for in the next chapters since the 1st chapter. Bron is already designated as Experiment 1199. That is, he is a full-fledged character, but he wasn't in the game. We only saw his toys, big and small. However, there exists a living Bron, the very Bron from the tape where they experimented on him. A certain Thomas Clark, terminally ill, agreed to this experiment, and lo and behold, his organs were transplanted into a toy. What happens next? Bron gets killed. Of course, they seriously harmed him, but it seems he is alive. At least there's no confirmation of his death. We can only guess. He was placed in solitary confinement. Whether he survived after the Joy Hour is unknown. As we know, the monsters at that moment started eating people, killed almost all employees. But it seems he is alive. At least there's no confirmation of his death. During the Joy Hour, the monsters killed almost all the employees, then fed on the leftovers, and then began to eat each other. Since Bron is quite small, not strong, he might have faced an unfortunate fate. The bigger monsters could have eaten the smaller ones. The further fate of Bron himself is unknown, but there's a not-so-small chance that he perished. Many forgot about the flower daisy, but it was once an experiment because in the 2nd chapter, we clearly saw that it was a rejected toy, at least because it was in a warehouse of such rejected ones. Of course, this doesn't prevent scientists from conducting their experiments. They could have taken someone from this warehouse, but all we know about Daisy is that it's rejected. Despite being in the trailer for the second wave, it was replaced in the end, and nowhere is it stated that Daisy is an experiment under some number. So I dare to assume that Daisy is not a monster at all. So Daisy is fine because it's just a regular toy. Scientists could only experiment on approved mascots, and they might not touch the rejected ones. Again, Daisy doesn't have an assigned experiment number. So it might not have gone anywhere, but was all in the same warehouse in the second chapter, considering Daisy even has its own poster. This is not just some picture from leaked files. It's a full-fledged poster. In the third chapter, maybe the Playtime company tried to develop this mascot, and some posters of it remained somewhere. I see no more reasonable explanation. Will we see this character in the future? Most likely not. It was already replaced in the second chapter, but since many people liked Daisy, the developers decided to leave references to it. And what about the rest of the monsters? You might have forgotten, but before Catnap, we already had popular cats like Cat Bee and Candy Cat. Neither the Bee Cat nor the Candy Cat was assigned an experiment number, but it's still too early to claim that these characters were not used. They are official mascots of the company, which means they could well have been taken for experiments and turned into monsters. So there's still a not-so-small chance that we'll see our kitties, and maybe not only them in the next chapter or in the continuation. Whether they will be evil or good is another question. It seems to me that it's not worth looking for allies within the company's territory anymore. If there's going to be some new friendly character, it's unlikely to be one of the old mascots. Though anything is possible, we don't know what happened to them and whether all the experiments during the Joy Hour were shown to us on tape. And now, I'd like to pose a little theory about where these experiments even came from. Could it really be that the factory had so many volunteers with incurable diseases? Too many? It's possible. I've said the word possible dozens of times in this video, and that's because we don't know much. But it's worth assuming that all these experiments, not just the big monsters, but also the small ones, weren't only on employees. In the third chapter, we find out that experiments could very well have been conducted on orphan children from Playcare. No one is responsible for the orphans except the Playtime company. And after all, no one will know what happens to them. They are entirely at the disposal of Playtime Co. and Dr. Harley Sawyer with his dirty experiments. In fact, the company's story is much darker than it seems. Because if some experiments were conducted with volunteers with incurable diseases, then the rest of the monsters, of which there are very many small smiling creatures or bloodied toys, could well be defenseless orphans used for terrible purposes. That's where the human resource for terrible experiments could come from. So there are so many of them, and we might still see some of them later. So what do you think happened to all these monsters? Write your opinion in the comments.